more folks to join. So get ready, get settled in, and we'll be right back with you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome. We're going to get started in just a minute as we let more folks get on the call. So just stay right with us. Thank you. Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to our town hall today. We thank you for joining the ERA Coalition, the Fund for Women's Equality, our discussion on Title IX, where we are currently with this landmark legislation and where we want to go with it. First, some housekeeping notes. We are recording this session and it will be made available along with notes and additional resources on our ERA Coalition blog. Also, if you're having sound issues watching through Eventbrite, you should be able to click through to Zoom to watch there. We're also live streaming on our Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok channels. If you need closed captioning, you can select that option from the Zoom screen as well. So thank you all for joining us today as we celebrate and recognize the 50th anniversary of the passage of Title IX. Thank you to our guest speakers for your efforts to ensure that Title IX is maintained and enforced in terms of both the letter and spirit of the law. The Title IX of the Educational Amendments of 1972 has been a critical mainstay in leveling the playing field for women and girls in education. Title IX covers educational programs and institutions receiving federal funds. It covers employment and treatment of students in K through 12 and higher education, and is administered by the U.S. Department of Education. In recent years, many of the complaints under Title IX have been about student treatment issues, including disciplinary actions, issues treating students of color differently than their white counterparts with regards to expulsion and suspensions, dress codes, and even hairstyles, the opportunities for parenting and pregnant students and the lack thereof, ensuring women and girls have equal access to math, science, technology programs and classes, and ensuring the rights of trans students have equal access to education. We won't be able to get to all of these issues today, but we're looking forward to a fantastic conversation. Now to introduce our panelists. Lindsay Piper is an associate professor of sports management and the director of the Gender Studies program at the University of Lynchburg. She's a sport historian whose research focuses on gender-based policies in international sports. She is also affiliated with Athlete Ally, an ERA Coalition partner. Thank you, Dr. Piper.
Thanks for having me.
Ria Tobacco-Marr is the director of the ACLU's Women's Rights Project, where she oversees the ACLU's women's rights litigation. Ria has been recognized on the Route 100 annual list of the most influential African Americans aged 25 to 45, and is one of the best LGBT lawyers under 40 by the National LGBT Bar Association. Kinyora, thank you for joining us, Ria.
Thank you for that very generous intro, Zakia.
Kinyora Parham, MSW, is the executive director of End Rape on Campus, which works to end campus sexual violence through direct support for survivors, prevention through education, and policy reform. Kinyora has served over the past decade working with youth and families, college students and administrators, and community and government leaders. Welcome, Kinyora.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
And Nina Chaudhry is Vice President and General Counsel and Senior Advisor for Education at the National Women's Law Center, where she provides in-house legal advice and representation to the NWLC Action Legal Fund and Action Fund and the NWLC Fund LLC, and works to protect the rights of women and girls to be free from sex discrimination in school. So let's get started. Nina, I'll start with you. What do you think is the unfinished business of Title IX?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Ncaa, for those nice introductions. I'll just kick off the conversation by saying, we've come a long way in the 50 years since Title IX was passed back in 1972. I think it's pretty clear that none of us would be on this call without Title IX because it was a law that was intended to open the doors to education for women and girls across the country. And because of that, many of us were able to go to college and to graduate school. There were quotas before Title IX was passed for women. And so I think sometimes it just helps to remember what the world was like. I know many of us weren't exactly necessarily around in 1972. I was, but I was 1 year old. So I am a Title IX baby for sure. So I think, clearly we've made a lot of progress. The unfinished business, frankly, is making sure that the law's promise is fulfilled in all those areas that Ncaa mentioned, right? So we're still seeing schools not addressing sexual harassment when students come forward. I've been involved in a number of cases, in fact, representing students where that has happened. They're being pushed out of school, whether it's because they faced harassment or violence in school or by fellow students or teachers, or because they're pregnant and parenting, which Title IX also covers. In the sports arena, women and girls are still being treated as second class. 50 years later, we see it at every level, all the way through the elite sports, even where Title IX doesn't technically apply, but which clearly has come about because of Title IX. And then we see discrimination against girls of color, against LGBTQI plus students. So really making sure that all of our students and all of the subgroups that Title IX covers, and Title IX covers everybody in education, right? As long as it's a federally funded education program, making sure that that promise is real for all students.
All right, thank you. Would anyone else like to tackle that question?
I mean, I'll jump in here. Excuse me. And I probably will be a little bit more specific in how I answered this, just given that we're now in this moment of the notice and comments period. The Department of Education had, on the 50th anniversary of Title IX, June 23rd, released their proposed regulations of Title IX to undo and restore protections for student survivors that the DeVos, under former Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, had essentially removed, and making it very dangerous, especially during a COVID year when all that had happened. And so particularly with the proposed regulations that we're currently reviewing and getting ready to prepare comment for, one of the things that I wanted to talk about was how the current regulations prohibit retaliation, but essentially fail to define it. And so under the proposed regulations, we know that the department has defined retaliation in circumstances under which it can occur, but the proposed regulations would essentially clarify that Title IX protects a person from retaliation, including peer retaliation. Retaliation would be defined as intimidation, threats, coercion, discrimination against anyone because the person has reported possible sex discrimination, making a sex discrimination complaint, or participated in any way in a recipient's Title IX process. So schools would be prohibited from taking action against a student or employee under its code of conduct for the purpose of intimidating, threatening, coercion, or discriminating against someone because they provided information or made a complaint regarding sex discrimination. And so another area too I wanted to bring up was the fact that, under the proposed regulations, they don't adequately address restrictive or disciplinary measures. They don't really define what that is. And so the impact on the lack of clarity around that will have on students who are seeking no contact directives from their institutions, and on professors or coaches or staff and others who play a role in supporting students in their educational experience at school is quite lacking. And so we're really hoping that, through the current Title IX NPRM period, that by way of making our comment, we're able to help address this concern during this time, and that it is actually addressed and that it's clarified in the upcoming finalized regulations.
Great.
Can I just ask one thing about that, Ncaa? We also are working with Ncaa and other partners to submit comments to these rules. And I just wondered if we could paste anything in the chat or if you'd rather send those resources out later, but we have a public comment and maybe others do too, that, you know, people can join if they'd like to add their voices.
You can definitely post in the chat, but we will be sending out a resources guide afterwards. So feel free to post to the chat if you so choose. But we will make sure that information is available after the conversation's over also. So rather than focusing specifically on what challenges are still exist or what we still need to do, what are some of the things that Title IX has done well?
I'm happy to jump in. I was really delighted to see both you and the intro, Ncaa, and then Nina pick up on how Title IX applies to the rights of pregnant and parenting students. This is an area where I think we've seen a real sea change in the last 50 years. And Title IX has really reshaped our understanding of sort of what it means to be a pregnant or parenting student. I mean, when Title IX was passed, it was typical for schools to force students to take pregnancy tests if they were suspected of being pregnant, to expel students from school against their wishes if they were pregnant, or perhaps send them to a homebound instruction program, even before the era of Zoom, where the homebound instruction was essentially no instruction at all. And today, those kinds of things, I might say feel unthinkable. I think sadly they're not unthinkable in the era that we now find ourselves in, but certainly they're not typical. And and I think most students would recognize if they were subjected to them that something was very wrong, and would know to complain, which I don't think was the case in 1972. It's also a place where I think we've seen the federal government really, be a bit ahead of the game. So the original Title IX implementing regulations in 1975, which were put out by what was then called the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, the predecessor to ED, expressly protected the rights of pregnant and parenting students as a form of, recognizing that pregnancy discrimination is a form of discrimination on the basis of sex. And while I think that's probably a no-brainer for folks on this call, it's just worth situating that in where, the developments were under other laws at the time. So in 1975, the Supreme Court had already said that pregnancy discrimination was not a form of sex discrimination under the Constitution. And it was 3 years before Congress essentially corrected the Supreme Court's similar mistake under Title VII, the workplace law, and passed the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. So it's a little bit in the weeds there, but the point is, Title IX in many ways has been out ahead of other forms of sex discrimination protections, and the federal government has been in the fortunate position, I think, of recognizing the many forms that sex discrimination can take in the context of Title IX, even when we were not yet as a country ready to recognize those same forms of discrimination as sex discrimination in the workplace or under the Constitution. So really, truly exciting there. And I think a place where Title IX is going to be, sadly, even more relevant as we look to so many students facing the reality of, forced pregnancy or forced birth. The protections of Title IX in this space are going to become, once again, quite relevant and even critical for so many students.
And Ria, thank you for bringing that up. We are the ERA Coalition, so Equal Rights Amendment is, of course, our main mandate. So how do you, and this is open to the panel, how do you think that having an Equal Rights Amendment as the law of the land would impact those kinds of decisions regarding students or regarding pregnant people across the board? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I would say I think it would have a major impact, right? I think it would further cement and officially guarantee protections under Title IX because, ERA is officially a part of the Constitution. It will guarantee equal protections and enforcement for gender equality. And I think that has been the goal, right, of ERA. And so I think, with that officially a part of it, we'll be able to change the future, I think, in a more productive way than we ever have seen before, and really, being able to cement and maintain and guarantee students from having a safe education environment that is free from sexual harassment because they have ERA as another kind of pinpoint to really say, oh, well, yeah, we have Title IX that protects us from this, but also our constitutional right says, and we can always bring up the ERA.
It's also interesting to think about what the ERA might invite Congress or other legislatures to do to really make the promise of equality a reality. And one of the things that I've always loved thinking about under, in the text of the ERA is that, 2-year delay between adoption and effective date. And with the idea being that this is going to be an opportunity for us as a country to really scrutinize our laws and see, what laws are in place that are inconsistent with the ERA's promise, and also what affirmative legislation do we need to pass to make the ERA's promise a reality. And so, of course, we don't need to wait for the ERA to be adopted to do that. We could do that right now. And I think it's inspiring to think about what legislation could provide even more affirmative protections than what we currently have.
Lindsay, if I can ask you to weigh in here, going back to the question of what has Title IX done right? You are a historian. Can you give us your perspective as to how the Title IX has been impactful across the board?
Yeah, absolutely. And in a way, this is the easiest for probably the group to answer, since I'm coming to it from sports. And I feel in a lot of ways that Title IX often is equated, of course, with athletic opportunities, even though that was never the intent of the original legislation. And Title IX has been successful in expanding opportunities for girls and women. In 1972, it was about 8% of girls in high school who played sports, 20% in college, roughly. And that's obviously just increased exponentially. And the experiences in 1972 is not just about the numbers. The experiences were also substantially less than students' male peers, making their own uniforms. Coaches weren't paid if they had coaches at all, not being able to participate on or in the facilities. So Title IX has done a lot of work in that area to increase the opportunities. But to what Ncaa pointed out, there is still work to be done. Of course, it's still not equitable. The Women's Sport Foundation just released a report that suggested about 86% of NCAA institutions are not Title IX compliant. So more are not Title IX compliant than are. So there's obviously a lot of ground to cover. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out too that it's been largely white female students who have benefited from Title IX. So I know this is a question about what has gone well, but there's of course work to be done too.
Yeah. So if you so along those lines, when we're talking about who has benefited from it and who may not have benefited as much, when we look at the number of states that have passed legislation that targets transgender students, how does Title IX fit into the scenario, and how can we use Title IX to protect trans students?
Yeah, so I mean, I can jump in and say that, because Title IX prohibits sex discrimination, right? And the Supreme Court has held that sex discrimination includes discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation. It's very clear that Title IX protects trans students. And I think that is one of the big areas where, unfortunately, we are seeing so many attacks on trans students right now. Whether it's harassment, violence that this population is suffering, bills targeting trans students and trying to deny them opportunities. This is an area where we really have a lot of work to do to ensure that, they can benefit equally from the educational opportunities, the facilities, can participate in sports programs. So yeah, I think the law, I think, is clear, but that's not stopping sort of the political animus and state legislatures and others from really trying to deny trans students, their rights.
Maria, I saw you took yourself off mute. You'd like to jump in there too?
Yeah, I mean, I echo everything that Ncaa said, and just wanted to say that, anti-trans activists have also tried to weaponize Title IX itself against transgender students. And so, well, of course, Ncaa has described Title IX, as it's written, as the Supreme Court has, I think, interpreted laws that prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, but we've seen for years now folks try to weaponize Title IX. So for example, we have seen cisgender students claim that allowing transgender students to use, common restrooms or locker rooms together with other students is somehow a violation of Title IX, that the presence of transgender students in shared public spaces is a form of sexual harassment. We've seen cisgender students argue that the presence of transgender students on sports teams consistent with their gender identity again, is itself somehow a form of discrimination against cisgender students. And while fortunately courts have largely rejected these arguments, I think the fact that they are continuing to be advanced and that they seem to have gained some toehold is really distressing, and kind of builds on a point that Dr. Piper made, which is sort of this idea of who does Title IX belong to, and whose interests does Title IX protect. And we've seen cisgender students really try to own or claim Title IX as their own, when in fact, as Nina said, Title IX protects all of us, right? All of us, of course, have a sex, all of us have a gender identity, all of us have a sexual orientation, and all of us are protected from discrimination on those bases. But we have seen students who occupy positions of relative power try to weaponize Title IX against more vulnerable students, and that's really distressing.
It is distressing, especially when you realize that that's happening across the board. Those with power try to minimize those without power to maintain their own. So it's good that we recognize that and we do our part to uplift it. So speaking about doing our part, if you all would go around and say, what are your organizations doing to help strengthen Title IX and to make sure it actually does what it's supposed to do and it's actually implemented the right way?
I'm not part of an organization necessarily, so I'm going to actually answer first, which probably doesn't make much sense. But it's to the point that Ray was just talking about these bills, and what I guess I would like to see work around is the Title IX to ensure that we are not carving out a special space for sport with these questions about trans athletes. The new document that was just released very specifically has that we're going to consider sports separately. And I'm deeply concerned by this. And I think it speaks to that weaponizing of Title IX, because on the basis of sex, very clearly does include, of course, gender identity and not discriminating on the basis of gender identity. And so while I'm not part of an organization, much of the work I'm doing right now is trying to prevent that from happening, to have some type of exception just for sports as a separate entity.
And Dr. Piper, you may not be part of an organization, but you are part of the movement. So let's claim that one. Who'd like to go next?
I can jump in here. And I also just want to tap into the question around transgender students as well. We shouldn't even be focusing on biological differences or any other type of identities in which a student has. If anything, we should be focusing on what makes schools safe for all students, regardless of, but with respect to their identities. And so I believe that transgender students, like everyone else, has a right to learn and thrive in an environment that is free from discrimination. But the sad reality is that we know that 1 in 4 transgender students and non-conforming students are sexually assaulted during their time in college. And so I'm very pleased to know that the Biden administration is making that concerted effort to be as inclusive of identities and actually recognizing that there are historically excluded and systemically marginalized communities that aren't often talked about or even acknowledged in this work. And so I think we've definitely come a long way where we're seeing that inclusivity really be not only talked about, but be a part of the national discourse when we're talking about this work. And so I would say with NRAPE on campus, what we have actually looked to create is students who are at the intersections of their identities, creating their own table. And what I mean by that is we have our Student Survivor Caucus that is a network of collegiate students. So whether they're undergrad or graduate students, with respect to their intersectional identities, we are equipping them with the tools, the best practices and resources in order to make change on their college campuses. So they meet on a bi-weekly basis during the academic year where they're learning on 3 different pillars of work. And that includes survivorship and wellness, sexual assault awareness and education, and political and advocacy work. And so they're actually being taught, what does it mean to be on the grassroots level, especially because they haven't been a part of the conversation and they may not have been equipped with these tools before. What does it look like to mobilize and galvanize their peers in order to make a difference on their college campus? Because we believe that students are truly at the heart and center of this work, and that they deserve an education that's free from harm, regardless of, but with respect to their identities.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
I can jump in here and say that, so the Law Center was actually founded the same year that Title IX was passed. So for 50 years, we have been working on Title IX in all of these areas, but primarily I would say in athletics and sexual harassment and with respect to pregnant and parenting students. We've done a variety of work over the years in various areas. So I think, right now we are focused, as Ncaa was talking about, on the proposed rules that the Biden administration has put forward, really trying to provide the input and push them to continue the work that they need to do, including on behalf of trans students and LGBTQI plus students. We have represented students in court. We are working at the congressional level, at the state level, weighing in wherever we can to support students who have been discriminated against, and working in coalition with many of the folks on this screen. So we will continue to do that. And also I should say that we have a project also focusing on pregnant and parenting students, because even though, as Ria said, things have gotten a lot better, it's always, I think, still shocking to me how blatantly schools can still discriminate and still do against pregnant students, whether it's not letting them have larger desks or wear different uniforms, really basic things that we're still seeing 50 years later.
Just chime in with a couple of examples. I mean, like Ncaa, and actually I think like all of the groups in this call, we are preparing our comments on the proposed Title IX rule, and really encourage everyone on the call to consider submitting their own comment. While we may not all agree on what the specific provisions should look like, I guarantee that everyone who has joined this call has a strong view about what those provisions should look like, and absolutely should make their voice heard. The administration hears from a wide range of us on what we think Title IX means and requires. I just wanted to highlight one other case we have going on, since the topic of dress codes has not come up much so far, and that has been a big area under Title IX. Another incredibly progressive regulation out from Health, Education, Welfare in 1975 was a regulation that expressly prohibited discrimination in dress codes. And unfortunately, the Reagan administration withdrew that regulation in 1982, and ever since then we have been arguing over if and to what extent Title IX prohibits discrimination in dress codes. So just to be absolutely clear, I mean, yes, Title IX prohibits education and dress codes. Title IX prohibits sex discrimination everywhere except the places it doesn't, and dress codes aren't on that list. And we know that dress codes are so often enforced more harshly against girls of color, against LGBTQ and gender nonconforming students, can result in students missing class, even being expelled from school, excluded from extracurricular activities. Super alarming. We in the Women's Rights Project are currently litigating a case involving a charter school that seeks to force girls to wear skirts in order to attend school, a question that we should not have to be talking about in 2022. And I mentioned this case because in some ways we're all, grimacing because it's an outlier, but of course, at the same time, it's not an outlier, because many, many schools are seeking the right to require girls to wear clothing that marks them as different, and suggest that that difference is relevant to the way that we learn and to the way that we perform at school, which we know not to be the case. And we've seen the charter school fight this. We're currently before the Fourth Circuit. They've recently vowed to ask the Supreme Court to take up the question. And so it's clear that those who would seek to reinforce stereotypical gender roles for girls at school will not stop, and we will not stop either.
So I can identify with that. I remember very clearly when I was in elementary school going to a private school, my mom's like, you have to wear a skirt. I said, no, I don't have to wear a skirt, but it still persists. And that's just terrible. I won't say how old I am, but it's old enough that shouldn't have been the case. It was after Reagan, put it that way. So what do you see as our greatest challenges going forward? We want to give people hope and optimism as to what we can do. So let's talk about those challenges. Who's most impacted by not enforcing Title IX the way it should be? Whose protections do we need to focus on, and what do we need to do? And what are some of the challenges that we have in sex equality in education today, and sports as well? It's a big question, I know. You can just take part of it.
Big question. And I mean, it's impossible to separate Title IX from society at large, right? You asked earlier, I think, what's the unfulfilled promise of Title IX? And I felt like, what is the unfulfilled promise of gender equality in this country? Right? What are the core problems of misogyny and patriarchy we're facing? And we see all of those problems, right? The intersection of patriarchy and white supremacy play out in the educational context, just like it plays out, at home and in the workplace and in other public places. So in many ways, I think Title IX captures all of those challenges, but it also offers, potentially an avenue for resistance and opportunities to fight back. So those of us who are, at the margins and are most vulnerable in other parts of life, also unsurprisingly, most vulnerable at school, most likely to be, targeted, suspended, excluded from opportunities, punished when we report our own harassment or assault, or when we show up at school, wearing clothes that are appropriate for our body, or, our hair, the way that it grows out of our head. So all of those problems that we see in other parts of life, we see at school too. And it's really difficult to sort of separate. I don't think we can separate those challenges from the challenges we see under Title IX.
I mean, one thing that I think can help and that we've seen work is, right, when people know about Title IX, and frankly, there still is a lot of lack of awareness among students and parents. There were surveys done right around the 50th anniversary this past June that showed just how many people still don't know that there is this law that can help them. And so absolutely +1 to all the challenges that everybody has mentioned. But I think spreading the word and, something that everybody can do, just letting people know that there is this law, because we have seen students take that and with such power and such activism make change. I really do think that there is a way to change schools and change communities, but we do need to educate folks and just raise awareness.
And jumping off of that point about awareness and education, there's been a lot of focus, as has already come up, on trans athletes, if bringing it to the sports lens. And as I've already mentioned, I'm concerned about the proposed regulations, that sports are going to be treated differently. But I really think the biggest challenge to this question, sex equality in education and by extension sport, is really the abuse and harassment that athletes face. So there's a lot of conversation on trans athletes, and I think that's being used for political reasons, really. But studies after studies are showing that athletes in the K-12 system and then in college as well, there's a lot of harassment, there's a lot of abuse. And I'd much prefer to see that be the focus of all this attention if we're talking about equality in sport.
Yeah.
And I would add to that, when we're talking about education, we should also be talking about prevention education, because that's not something that I think in Title IX has ever been explicitly talked about. And so even, seeing a new Title IX rule that would clarify who's responsible for coordinating prevention education, as it should be required for all institutions of higher education, K through 12, especially as in alignment with the Clarity Act, the law that requires colleges and universities to report campus crime data, right? But with that data, we also want to be cognizant of the fact that while we have the statistics like the 1 in 5 or the 1 in 15, meaning, for example, for every one Black woman who doesn't report, who reports, 15 do not. We need to be spreading that information, but also taking into account the different cultural aspects that play a role, being more culturally sensitive, respectful of folks and their identities, and really understanding at a very basic level of what students are working with and the many myriad of issues that affect their psychological, their mental health, their financial, well-being, as well as just even their own, where they are living, physically where they're located. So taking those things into account, part of prevention education being more culturally sensitive and culturally informed and meeting students with where they're at in order to really provide those preventative measures. Because what we're going to continue to see is that double red zone occur. And for those who are unfamiliar with the red zone is a time in which students arrive on campus through Thanksgiving break, where more than 50% of campus sexual assault occurs. And we've seen that number intensify this past academic year because students were arriving for the first time back to campus since the COVID closure. And so really taking into account, as students returning to campus, what are some of the preventive measures that we need to be thinking about? How do we ensure that our students are aware of what could happen, but also how are they, what should we as school administrators be providing our students to ensure that they know that this campus is safe? What are the resources, not just on campus, but also outside of campus? And how can we make sure that if a student does disclose and reports, that we're doing our due diligence under Title IX to ensure that they're protected?
And Rhea, you made an excellent point about how we can't really dissect Title IX in education from the real world, because a lot of these issues overlap. Like, we see these same issues in the general public, and we need to address them there, but we also need to make sure that we're addressing them so our youngest, most vulnerable people don't have to deal with this. I'm just appalled that some of the discrimination that we take out on kids, they're just kids. Even if they're in college, I'm sorry, you're still a kid, in my opinion, until you're legally not. So there was a question in the comments or in the Q&A. And I know we're going to get to the Q&A in a second, but I do want to bring that up. So Nina, thank you for sharing. The deadline for submitting comments is September 12th. Is there a way that we can tell folks how to submit comments? How would they go about doing that?
I would love to I'll add the links to sign on to the various organizations' comments. I'll include the link to submit comments directly in the recap with the recording, and we'll send it out to everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chrissy.
Yep.
So I want to ask one more question before we open it up to the group. And really, it's kind of a call to action. So what should we, as the general public, be doing to protect students and ensure that Title IX fulfills its promise? What's our call to action after this conversation? You've all said pieces of it, so let's just give them a snippet at the end that summarizes all of it.
I would say, depending on and with respect to whatever your role is, your position is, especially for student survivors, and I would even say employees who experience sexual harassment or assault, is to first and foremost believe people when they come to you and disclose. That's the first part, I would say. And if anything, that's probably the most critical thing that you could ever do for a survivor who discloses a traumatic experience. And then I would say meeting that person with where they're at and how they would want to proceed in with navigating through that experience. And even if you don't have the answers, helping them to find out what type of resources are out there. And you can send them to places like NRAPE on campus and NWLC. So that way we could also provide them with those resources that if we don't have them, we can always, partner with our other advocacy partners in this work. But I think really, first and foremost, believing survivors and, making sure that you're helping them to navigate through that space with their consent, of course, on that as well. And then I would say one other concrete thing is, as Nina and Rhea had mentioned, we're all working on the NPRM process to submit comments. And so we too will be sharing a comment in collaboration with It's On Us, another advocacy organization that works to include men in the conversation. And so we'll be submitting a comment by the deadline as well, along with supporting our fellow advocates on this call with the comments that they will be submitting too. And so one way to do that is through, and I'll share this link with ERA folks who will be sharing more resources at the end of this call, a link that we have in terms of reforming Title IX that folks can also sign on to as well.
Thank you. And Kenyara, I don't mean to be glib when I call college students kids. I don't really mean that. I'm just saying that when I was in college, I was still a kid till in my 30s. So it's okay. We're still growing and maturing in that age range.
Absolutely.
Dr. Piper, any thoughts for what we can leave people with that they can do going forward?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts on this. One, is again repeating a little bit, just that sports are no different than any other educational activity and therefore should not be treated as such. Preventing discrimination against students on the basis of sex should include sports, and there shouldn't be treated separately. So that's one element of it. But the other two is any help in changing the conversation. Unfortunately, as we've already mentioned, the LGBTQI plus community is being attacked at the moment. There's a lot of bills and laws that are going forward or going into effect. And a subset of that, of course, is about trans athletes, so trans kids playing in sports. And so helping to change that conversation, because I think there's a lot of fear mongering that's happening right now. And there's a lot of misinformation that's being spread about what it means to be trans, what it means to be a trans athlete. And so helping to shift that idea that at the end of the day, we are talking about kids. And I like that definition of kids, that it's up through college. We're talking about kids who want to live their life, want to play their sports with their friends, and we should let them do that. And so pushing back against perhaps some of what the anti-trans activists are saying in this conversation.
And Dr. Piper, will you send us some resources we can share on how we can change that conversation?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great, thank you. Nina? You're next on my screen.
Sure. Going back to something I said earlier, I think one of the things that we can really do to protect students is in each of our communities and all the spaces that we're in, just really raising awareness about Title IX, things like asking if schools have Title IX coordinators. Very nuts and bolts, but the law actually requires every school or district to have a Title IX coordinator. As a lawyer who's represented students, I can't tell you how many times we've called schools to say, who's your Title IX coordinator? And it's like, hang on, they don't have a Title IX coordinator. Then they go designate somebody and say, oh, it's so-and-so. So, it's not as though just having a Title IX coordinator solves everything, but it's a big step, right? To have somebody there who students know they can go to, then you have to make sure that person's trained, understands what their role is, isn't overburdened, which they typically all are because they're doing 50 other things. But I think, in individual communities, when we see those disparities and those inequities, at all these levels on all these things we've talked about, speaking up, strength in numbers, giving people the tools that they need so that they can go to their schools and say, this isn't right, and we want you to do something about it. I mean, it doesn't always work, but I got to say, we've worked with a lot of students who, even short of litigation or complaints, have made changes by just speaking up. And it takes a lot of courage, and I am in awe of all those young people who have done that. And their parents, who often are the ones that we're working with. But I really think some of those simple things that we can all do in our own communities can make a big difference.
Thank you. Maria, last but not least.
Building on so much of what my fellow panelists have said, I think, we really can amplify the voices of young people. One of the things that is so inspiring to me has been to see how much our young people today and students today sort of instinctively recognize, what's wrong and are able to articulate it and advocate for themselves in ways that I think many of us on this call probably would not have been able to do, or at least I know I would not have been able to do at that age. And I think the key, even of your example, of being forced to wear a skirt as a child yourself, it's amazing to me to see students today recognizing dress coding as racist and sexist, recognizing the breadth and the range of folks' gender identity and sexual orientation in a just more natural and instinctive way than many adults are able to do. So many of the problems that we're seeing happen when adults are projecting their own agendas onto our young people. And if we listen to young people and we see where they are and we amplify their voices, I truly think we can make an amazing amount of progress.
Oh, that's a great place to transition. Chrissy, I'll let you open up to the questions to the group.
Awesome. We have several really, really great questions in the Q&A. I'll just begin at the top. So I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit. We have one question about schools that are suggesting, gender checks to use restrooms. Could Title IX help with this kind of discrimination and making sure that it doesn't come to the school near you?
This is so distressing. I mean, this notion about sort of gender verification, which, building on something Dr. Piper said earlier, I mean, the notion of gender verification sort of is most often weaponized against Black women, often Black cisgender women for that matter. And the notion that gender or race can be sort of biologically confirmed, is really a notion rooted in white supremacy. And we certainly don't want schools to be engaged in gender verification. And we know who's going to be harmed by this. It's going to be Black girls and other girls of color, many of them cisgender for that matter. Not that we shouldn't be concerned about harm to transgender students, but just to be really clear about how this works. I mean, fortunately, you know, nobody should be seeing anybody else's private parts in the school bathrooms. And, you know, one of the things that's been so misleading is misinformation or the suggestion that somehow students are, you know, stripping or changing clothes completely in public areas at school. That's not the way young people today are using restrooms and locker rooms. And that's also not what folks are complaining about. I mean, in one lawsuit I was involved in, we had a cisgender student allege in a complaint that Title IX was violated because she saw a transgender student washing her hands at the sink in the common area of the restroom. And she alleged that that was a form of sexual harassment. So just to be really clear what we're talking about, she was washing her hands at the sink in the public area of a restroom. So absolutely, Title IX not only does not require gender verification, right? We think it prohibits this kind of policing. And most concerningly, we know who this kind of policing is going to be weaponized against because we've seen it happen time and time again.
Yeah, if I can actually jump in there on this gender verification piece, because there is unfortunately a very long history of this happening in sports. And it was at the elite level. It started in the 60s, where it actually was a nude parade where women athletes were forced to have their anatomy checked. It only stopped in different variations through the 90s. Ray is absolutely correct that this often targeted women of color at the elite level. And so there's no reason to think that that's not exactly what would happen again if we see schools doing this as well. It's been written into a lot of the bills about trans athletes and their participation. As someone who studies history and has studied the history of sex testing in sport, it is just completely distressing to me and shocking that we're having these conversations again as if this is something that's a positive to do. It's actually absolutely traumatizing, humiliating, and just completely awful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to combine two questions that we have on Title IX and reporting campus sexual assault and harassment. So Marge asked about schools, you know, there are reputations of them sort of hiding or undercounting numbers. I'm wondering if that's a problem. And then also Diane asks if there's a better way to collect stats on campus sexual assault and harassment, and you know, with the Supreme Court, if there's anything that we can do to protect Title IX in the future from being overturned or gutted. I know it was a lot.
I think I can start off by saying that, particularly for Title IX coordinators, are first and foremost are obligated under Title IX to fulfill their obligations by not only once they receive a report on Title IX, but moving through the policies and procedures that are laid out under Title IX to ensure that a prompt and equitable investigation is happening. This person is supposed to have the expertise and authority to move forward with those things and be a proactive gender equality leader in this work. But oftentimes what we have come across with students that we've spoken with is that there are a number of Title IX coordinators that are often having another role at the school, so a conflict of interest that they may prioritize over them being the Title IX coordinator. For example, there are some schools in which they have a Title IX coordinator that is also the director or an assistant director of Greek life, which is a complete conflict of interest. And so unfortunately, they are prioritizing the needs of fraternities more specifically, because we often know that it's fraternities that are often committing sexual harassment and assault on campuses. And so unfortunately, we're seeing things like that happening with Title IX coordinators often being, in a sense, double dipping within their roles, but also denying students access to their right for investigation, whether it's formal or informal processes as well, because of their limited capacity that they have either because they have another role that they have, or it's because they have too many reports that are coming in that they can't handle. Because not all schools may have about 3 Title IX coordinators. Sometimes some schools may have one person. And even if we're talking about the K through 12 space, you may have one Title IX coordinator that's there for an entire district that's made up of about 75,000 students at times. And so there isn't enough, I think, bodies on the ground that are provided to do their due diligence as a Title IX coordinator under Title IX. And then with respect to how can we do better in terms of the stats that are coming in. So the other part of that too is that under the Clery Act, schools are federally required to disclose crime statistics that happen on their campus on an annual basis. And that is October 1st of every year. And that data is then collected, I believe, from the past 3 years, and then it's then publicized on their website, which is a campus safety and security website that's managed by the Department of Education. End Rape on Campus is actually, and this is something we're getting ready to do next month, is actually launch a new digital platform that centralizes the statistical data for current and prospective college students and their communities, with the ability to compare that data across different college campuses, including going deeper into the policies and procedures of each college and university across the United States. So that's one of the things that we are tackling, because a lot of students are unaware of their Title IX laws, what Title IX is, their rights under Title IX, where to find it on their school's website. And so we're helping to centralize that data into one space to be able to provide folks with that information.
That's
I wanted to
amazing.
pick up on another piece of that question, which I think was about the Supreme Court, and to say, both, I think obviously those fears are not misplaced. We saw even last term a terrible decision in a case involving disability discrimination, but that's really limited the ability of victims of discrimination, including students who sue under Title IX, to recover for emotional distress damages, which so often, because we are talking about young people who may not yet have jobs or other kinds of obvious monetary loss, like someone who's experiencing discrimination in the workplace, oftentimes what those students are going to be experiencing is that distress, that trauma. And by limiting the ability of students to recover damages for that kind of harm, the court also disincentivizes private attorneys from taking on these kinds of cases, which is a big problem, because Title IX relies on private attorneys essentially as a real enforcement mechanism to require schools to comply. So that's the bad news. The good news is Title IX is a statute. So unlike the Constitution, which, as we all know, is very, very difficult to change, first of all, Congress did a pretty good job in laying out protections from sex discrimination in the statute that we already have. And to the extent that the Supreme Court tries to cut off Title IX at its knees, right, we can go back to Congress and press them to make clear what Title IX in fact requires. And that's a much more straightforward path, obviously, than amending the Constitution. So we've got great words on the books, and to the extent the Supreme Court gets them wrong, we can go back to Congress and tell them to let the Supreme Court know if they get it wrong.
I don't think you have to remind our audience how hard it is to amend the Constitution. We're with you there. That was really great and really helpful. We do have a question from Denny in North Carolina. How do we impact the election of qualified members of local school boards, those interested in public schools and equality? Putting on your electoral caps.
Other than voting?
Well, I would say
Yes.
probably recruiting more diverse candidates would
Yeah.
probably be a first step. Candidates that represent communities that are maybe often more targeted or less represented in the school leadership would be the first route. And then obviously getting out the vote and voting for those folks.
Yeah, and maybe asking the kinds of questions, right, that we're talking about here, to get a sense of what those folks are really thinking about these issues in Title IX, because I think often those are not things that people are asked about.
Yeah.
We need to pay attention when they vote on these issues and hold them accountable to that.
I just wanted to say, I love this question. I'm so glad people are paying attention to local school board elections, because we know our opponents have been paying attention to this space for a long time. And in fact, these kinds of local elections are often targeted for voter suppression or gerrymandering, on precisely the theory that folks on our side aren't paying attention, and that it's a way to exercise real power over the way that young people in the community are going to develop and to learn. So it is absolutely fantastic to see folks on our side focusing on this.
Yeah, and we're at ground zero here in a lot of cases in Northern Virginia. So we know how that sometimes goes. Yeah. We do have a question via private chat about what current college students can do just to support each other in allyship. And, especially with trans students who are often targeted. And, if there's anything that you could suggest or resources that students can share with each other.
Absolutely. So at NRAPE on campus, we actually on our website have a number of survivor support resources that students can utilize. And if they're looking to get involved with, even more in terms of advocacy, how to mobilize their peers, spread awareness on their college campuses, they're more than welcome to apply for our year 2 of our Student Survivor Caucus that we have open right now. So I'll also share that application link with our ERA hosts.
Thank you. That would be awesome.
And we have one more amazing student-led organization, Know Your Nine, who is not represented on this call, but we actually represented them in a lawsuit against the DeVos Title IX rule, and they have fantastic resources on their website about campus organizing, as well as students can apply to join their team as organizers as well. So I just wanted to name that as another great resource.
That is amazing, and we'll include that in our recap with resources too. Sorry, Dr. Piper.
No, I just want to make the plug for Athlete Ally for the trans athlete front. They're doing great work, and students can get involved through that organization. So I wanted to make sure that I identified them.
Lovely, thank you. One quick question, if we can answer it in just very like a minute or two. If there were any noted impacts or numbers on Title IX impacting students dropping out, like K through 12, and if so, what those numbers looked like. If anyone has that info.
I don't have the numbers on K through 12, but I know Your Nine wrote a report on the cost of reporting, and that was reported about 40% of students drop out of education following their report to Title IX. So I only have on the higher education side, but I'm not sure about the K through 12.
Okay, well, we can try to find those numbers and maybe include something on that in our resources too. Thank you so much. I'll turn it back over to Ncaa. Thank you all.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. I've learned a lot, I know, and I think it's been a fantastic conversation. Again, Ncaa Chaudhry is the Vice President and General Counsel and Senior Advisor for Education at the National Women's Law Center. Kinyora Parnam is MSW is the Executive Director of End Rape on Campus. Ria Tobacco-Mar is the Director of the ACLU's Women's Rights Project. And Dr. Lindsay Parks Piper is the Associate Professor of Sports Medicine and the Director of Gender Studies Program at the University of Lynchburg. Thank you all so much for being with us and for sharing your insight. Thank you for sharing the resources that you have. And for those of you who were participating in today's call, whether you listened in or shared a question or comment, we appreciate your support and your interest in this topic. And let's go out there. Let's make the world a better place for students and for folks in the workplace. So thank you all for your hard work and the work that you've done. And let's go out there and continue the fight. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Okay. Well, thank you guys. I really do appreciate the conversation. I did learn a lot because Title IX wasn't even on my radar when I was in college. So, but thank you all for the hard work you're doing. And